Most people know Old Quebec, the most historic and picturesque part of Quebec City, that competes with the Rocky Mountains and Niagara Falls for the most iconic tourist destination in Canada. But there's a lot more to this city than just the Old Town. While it does gradually turn into suburbs that aren't too dissimilar from what you'd find elsewhere in North America, in between is a central city of neighborhoods that are dense, walkable, and increasingly bike-friendly, although we're going to save cycling for its own video. For some quick background, Quebec City is the capital and second largest city of the French-speaking Canadian province of Quebec, 270 kilometers or 170 miles down the St. Lawrence River from its larger sibling of Montreal.
Just west of Old Quebec is the neighborhood of Saint-Jean-Baptiste, one of the first areas settled after expanding beyond the Old City, with some of the oldest architecture and narrowest streets outside of the walls. St. John Street is pedestrianized on summer weekends, although the section back in Old Quebec is pedestrianized half the year from May to October. Continuing west, there's the neighborhood of Montcalm, with the lively Cartier Avenue and the Fine Arts Museum. One more neighborhood over is Saint-Sacrement, where we stayed for a few weeks while in Quebec City in 2019 for a French program, right before we moved to Montreal. This is where the city starts to feel more suburban, although many streets retain the denser character. Down the cliff that divides the central city between the Upper Town and Lower Town are the two traditionally working-class neighborhoods of Saint-Sauveur and Saint-Roch, with lots of small streets. When you zoom in on a map of Quebec City, you'll see a little parcel of land between these two neighborhoods that's not a part of Quebec City. The Hôpital Général de Québec is a religious and hospital complex dating back to the 1600s, and it's actually the smallest municipality in Quebec, Notre-Dame-des-Anges, with a population of about 250, mainly nuns and residents of the long-term care facility. Across the St. Charles River is Limoilou, maybe the neighborhood of Quebec City that feels most like Montreal. Overall, Quebec City's central neighborhoods aren't as large or as dense as Montreal, but for the size of the city, with a metro area population well under 1 million, it's actually quite a lot of dense neighborhoods by North American standards.
Quebec City's density and urban fabric in these central neighborhoods comes from it being an old industrial city, but also from Quebec inheriting different architecture and housing norms from English North America. For cultural, economic, and legal reasons, Quebec has traditionally had less of an emphasis on single-family homeownership, even among the wealthy. The row houses, multiplexes, and low-rise apartments that define the central neighborhoods here often have French architectural styles, or the distinctly Quebec external staircases and abundant balconies, depending on the neighborhood and era. There are obvious parallels with Montreal, although some of the buildings and configurations remind us more of smaller cities in Quebec, like Trois-Rivières. You can even find traces of this history in suburbs across Quebec, where multi-family housing is somewhat more common than in English North American suburbs. Suburbs across Quebec also tend to have a lot of swimming pools for some reason.
Like a lot of other places across North America and Europe, Quebec City underwent a period of urban renewal in the 1960s and 70s that leaves a mark on it today. Thousands of homes were demolished for highways, wider roads, and modern office and commercial developments, including functionaries for Quebec's growing welfare state and social services. Centrally located Saint-Jean-Baptiste was the most affected, but there were also demolitions in places like Saint-Roch, which lost a big chunk of the neighborhood, including the city's Chinatown, to the Dufferin-Montmorency Expressway. It was this large-scale demolition of neighborhoods and cities that contributed to the modern phenomenon of NIMBYism, where planners and residents have become skeptical of any neighborhood change, even voluntary, incremental, and organic.
Walking around, we saw quite a few pedestrian improvements. This street in the neighborhood of Saint-Jean-Baptiste is being converted into a slow shared street to have more greenery and be more pedestrian-friendly. When the city has to explain shared streets in their presentations, they're able to point to examples in Old Quebec that people recognize. Not far away, this intersection was upgraded with curb extensions and bike lanes, and they're putting down paving stones for another shared street. We just saw these walking around, but Quebec City has a pretty handy website compiling all the major roadwork projects with information on changes and timelines. We also saw lots of pedestrian improvements in Limoilou. Curb extensions narrow the road and increase visibility at intersections and add greenery to the streetscape. We saw multiple ruelles vertes, or green alleys, which, like in Montreal, limit car traffic in alleys and often have greenery or attractions for kids. We saw this street getting wider sidewalks. This 5-point intersection was simplified by blocking off one of the roads to traffic to create a plaza that hosts events. In Saint-Sauveur, we saw this parking lot was cut in half to create an expanded pedestrian plaza where we sat with our coffee and tea. There's a monument to locals killed at this location during the conscription crisis, when Quebecers opposed the federal government's attempts to force people into service to fight in World War I. About a decade ago, an important intersection in Saint-Jean-Baptiste was transformed from this to this, simplifying and narrowing the intersection on top of redeveloping the parking lot. Here's another angle, before and after. There's a good chance that the parking lot was itself a block of housing or some other building in the past that got demolished for parking. A lot of the pedestrian improvements and dense housing developments we see today are basically rolling back the car-centric destruction of cities that happened in the past, except that today we're seeing more incremental change.
Despite these improvements, being a pedestrian in Quebec City is a bit of a pain. There are a lot more beg buttons compared to Montreal, and they're the kind that you actually need to press to be able to cross. Also, a very high number of intersections are set up as pedestrian scrambles. Instead of pedestrians getting a green light in the same direction as traffic, they wait for both directions of traffic before getting a third pedestrian-only phase where you can walk in any direction. It's pretty nice if you want to cross the street diagonally, and they can be a way to handle busy intersections at important crossroads, like Yonge and Dundas in Toronto or Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo. But most of the time we found it annoying having to wait so long to cross when walking down a street in one direction. You spend a lot of time standing and watching green lights for cars while you can't go. Sometimes the one-way street configurations mean that it's literally impossible for cars to turn across your path, but you still don't get a walk sign. In theory, it's good to separate pedestrians from cars for safety, but if it's too inconvenient, it can encourage a culture of just ignoring the lights and walking anyway. We probably prefer a more normal light configuration, with a leading pedestrian signal that gives pedestrians a head start before drivers can go.
The housing in Quebec City might remind you of Montreal, but one Montreal feature you won't find here is a metro station. Quebec City is the largest metropolitan area in Canada that doesn't have urban rail transit. Its closest equivalents in population, Winnipeg and Hamilton, don't either, but it's bigger than Kitchener-Waterloo, which does. Quebec City does have 6 high-frequency metro bus lines that run 4 to 6 and sometimes up to 10 buses an hour on weekdays. There have been plans to build a tramway in Quebec City for decades, inspired by a new generation of successful tramways in France. The challenge, aside from political delays and indecisiveness, has been rising construction costs. In 2023, the price tag for the Quebec City tramway jumped from $3 billion to $8 billion. The Premier of Quebec put the project on pause and asked the CDPQ, the profit-driven publicly owned pension fund that built the REM in Montreal, to take a look. They came up with a new tramway plan that's a little cheaper and somewhat longer, although using some unexpected technology, and the government signed off. The construction cost problem isn't specific to Quebec. Transit projects have seen exploding costs in English Canada, the US, UK, Hong Kong, and so on. Subway projects in Toronto and New York now cost multiple times what they did in the past. What's interesting is that Quebec has been following the trend of these mostly English-speaking countries instead of the places that have kept costs relatively low, like France, Spain, Sweden, and Korea, which now build transit at a fraction of the cost of the Anglosphere. Our exploding construction costs mean that we get less transit. If Quebec could build as cheaply as France, we could have a whole new generation of tramways in suburbs and smaller cities across the province. Rising costs and delays also have ripple effects across society. Housing developments along the Quebec City tramway have been shelved due to uncertainty over when or if it would be built.
The other major transportation controversy in Quebec City is over building a third crossing of the St. Lawrence River to the South Shore suburb of Lévis. There are currently 2 bridges at the far western edge of the city, but in the east the only option is a ferry. The current provincial government promised a 3rd link in 2018, but left the design up in the air and proposals have been all over the place. Is it going to be a bridge or a tunnel? Is it going to go through or under the center of Quebec City, or around by way of the eastern suburbs? Is it going to include dedicated lanes for transit? Then in 2023 it was leaked that they planned a transit-only tunnel, with no cars or trucks, due to rising costs and decreased travel post-COVID.
We have to look at this and make the responsible and pragmatic decision.
But this was controversial among their base, and a surprising election loss in the western suburbs of Quebec City prompted them to put cars back on the table literally the next day.
Et pour rebâtir la confiance, François Legault ravive l'idée d'un 3e lien autoroutier entre Québec et Lévis.
That's despite the fact that the CDPQ, now managing the tramway project, said that any new crossing should be dedicated to a second tramway line running north-south. When you consider the 3rd link and the tramway, Quebec City has one of the highest levels of uncertainty about the future of its transportation network in the country.
Quebec City is at one end of the Quebec City to Windsor corridor, by far the busiest and most useful intercity train corridor in Canada. It's a 3.5-hour ride from Montreal, although if you're coming from Toronto, it starts to be more appealing to fly, at least until we maybe someday get high-speed rail. The train drops you off at Gare du Palais on the edge of Old Quebec, with a fairly sizable hill between you and the hotels downtown. Right behind the train station is the much less ornamental intercity bus station, with Orleans Express buses mainly serving cities in Quebec. We've never flown into Quebec City, but the airport is on the far western edge of the city.
Part of the point of this video is to encourage people to explore more of Quebec City outside of the most touristy areas. But Old Quebec is definitely still worth visiting. On top of all the narrow streets and old architecture, there's a lot of creativity put into decorations and art installations. You'll even see some real bollards, just like Europe. Just be aware that it can be very busy. We also took the ferry over to Lévis, although it was mostly for the views. For the views, for the views, for the views. After a day of walking up and down Quebec City's hills, we didn't have the time or energy to walk up another cliff. When we were here back in 2019, we also visited Montmorency Falls east of the city, accessible by bus, which has great views. Bring a zoom lens if you have one. In the future, we'd like to come back and explore further up the coast and into the mountains, maybe going to one of the national parks.
Quebec City is in the French-speaking province of Quebec, so most people speak French as their main language. Speaking English as a second language is common but not universal. 42% of people in Quebec City can speak English versus 65% in Greater Montreal. Like in Montreal, it depends a lot on context. Anywhere that serves lots of tourists will be extremely used to using English, but if you venture outside of tourist contexts, it becomes more appreciated to try in French to the extent that you can, or at least say désolé, anglais, rather than jumping into English. Even people who are good in English might not appreciate their second language sprung on them without warning. Typically, younger people are more bilingual than older people. While we refer to it as Quebec City in English, in French it's just called Québec, like the province. How you distinguish them is with prepositions. If you're in Quebec the province, you say, Je suis au Québec. But if you're in Quebec the city, you say, Je suis à Québec. We don't have a way to distinguish them with prepositions in English, so we refer to the city as Quebec City.
Quebec City has something of a rivalry with Montreal, or so we learned from our French teacher when we spent a few weeks here in 2019. But we always enjoy visiting. We've had the opportunity to spend more time in Canada's mid-sized cities this year, Calgary, Edmonton, and now Quebec City, and it's been fun and informative. Like we mentioned, we'll be covering cycling in Quebec City in his own video later. Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.